So what we have here, so in Western art history, we have three somewhat agreed upon overarching themes that art follows. We have art for God's sake, art for man's sake, and then art for art's sake. And that kind of covers the progression, very overarching progression. Some of the oldest that we have are Lascaux, France, and Altamira, Spain, cave paintings. And this is where, I was thinking about in these terms of this art for God's sake, man's sake, and art's sake. And I think at first we had art for nature's sake. Like we had artists who were they had, for whatever reason, whatever the purpose of making these artworks, it was reflecting what they saw in front of them. So this is often where a lot of art history classes will start, is with these cave paintings. And that is at one time was called the Venus of Willendorf. Willendorf being an area up in near Germany or in Germany. They've started calling her the Woman of Willendorf because obviously this was pre-Roman times. The people who made this wouldn't have called it a Venus figure. But it's for the most part agreed upon that she's a fertility figure of some sort, due to her curvaceous body, the fact that her belly looks like she might be with child, and that her breasts look like she has either had children or is going to have a child. Now, these early art, if not cave paintings, was utilitarian of some sort. So many people agree that she was most likely something that the medicine woman or healer of the group would have held or given to, say, a couple who was maybe trying to conceive. But a lot of the old pieces are utilitarian. So I am jumping way ahead. Okay, so because I kind of skipped over Greece and Rome and all of that at least in my printouts. I have a little bit, but so the Greek and the Roman artists, there was a lot of vases, a lot of sculpture, a lot of architecture. Now that's where I definitely think we get into the art for God's sake, because we're talking about temples dedicated to their gods. Scenes from their mythology painted on the vases, on utilitarian objects, frescoes on the walls, and then bas relief or full round sculpture that is devoted to, again, the gods in some way. I just heard this wonderful connection I'd never thought of, that human history is almost, and art history especially, is based in like patronage. So the idea that you have the haves who have the money, who then patronize the have-nots in some way. They do the work to get the money. But in a way, all of humankind were the have-nots for the gods, and the gods were like, back in these days, people believed that they were making these art and these temples in devotion to the gods, and the gods would bestow upon them the gifts. So there's that aspect that I had never really thought of, that I thought was really, really cool. And then you have Greek art, and the Romans thought the Greeks were just the coolest thing ever. Okay, so they modeled a lot after the Greeks. And then the Romans take some technology a little bit further than the Greeks did. For instance, the Romans invent the arch, which changes architecture. And we have the dome I'm gonna have to look in the book, because it is one that I have marked with the oculus. It's a Roman temple that at some point was made into a church. And so that's a big, huge contribution that Rome made to the history of art and architecture. The Greeks made contribution in what's called contrapposto. So in their sculptures, you have Egyptian sculptures that are very like stoic and straight, and the Greeks were the ones that kind of learned how to make them look more realistic by having that hip and that shift of weight. And so those are the contributions we got. Very, very, again, this is way overview. Some of the big contributions we got from them. We got way more than that, but those are the bigs. I wanted to get into the Christian art and move forward from there because really, again, Greek, Rome, and then into Christian art, we have art for God's sake. And so the early Christians, it's hundreds of years after Christ's death to when we have our first representations, we think because they were so heavily persecuted by the Romans at first. But your earliest Christian art were in Roman catacombs, which is also indicative that Christians were basically having their services in secret. They were meeting in secret, but they started illustrating the stories of Jesus's life. And then we move into like the Byzantine era, and this is where I find overlap of art for God's sake or art for man's sake, because this is in a church in Ravenna, Italy, and here's Emperor Justinian, right? Hanging out with all these church folks. Golden halo, like he's a saint. So, but again, most art at this time was in some way either being dedicated to the church, it was to adorn the church, it was to illustrate the Bible. So then we have Giotto, who brings us to, he is often attributed as the first Renaissance artist because we go from these very flat representations, right, to Giotto starts adding what we call chiaroscuro. My Italian is not very good. It's the shading that makes things look a little 3D, okay? So before we just had pretty flat 2D representations, then we start having these 3D representations, which then this is important because it starts calling artists' attention to man, to the people they are using as models. And so that starts to draw attention to, meanwhile, there's also a lot going on in science, literature, all these other things. Okay, so again, we're touching on very, very like high overarching umbrella bullet points. So then we start to have the Renaissance, and so from Giotto, we start to have artists that are now expanding upon his ability to make these figures look somewhat 3D to very 3D, and then even have perspective so that this painting, the scene goes back, whereas before they would have kind of stacked it all on top. Now I picked these two by Titian. Most people would probably go with Leonardo or Michelangelo to illustrate the Renaissance, but I picked Titian because we have Luncheon on the Grass and we have the Venus of Urbino. So again, we're still in art for God's sake for the most part. The reason these ladies at this time were able to be nude is because they're representing gods. So the Renaissance...
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on, let me zoom back in. I didn't even know I was zoomed out.
So the Renaissance also brings a resurgence of interest into the Greek myths, Roman myths, and those gods. And there was a great attempt to somewhat successful ends of Christian theologians managing to tie the Greek and Roman mythology as a precursor to the coming of Christ. They did a very good job of finding the way. So you start seeing in the Renaissance a shift from that art for God's sake towards the Christian, and now we're back to being focused on the mythology of Greece and Rome, because we've had a resurgence in interest in Plato specifically. And that's a whole nother discussion about the Middle Ages specifically. But so you do start to see some of these Greek and Roman scenes. And so here, the reason, again, these women are, it's acceptable for them to be nude is because they're depicting goddesses, according to the artist. This Venus of Urbino was made for the Count of Urbino. It's what he would have had in his dressing room, or say, the Renaissance idea of a bathroom, kind of. And it's basically what we would call like a boudoir painting. And we think it was his mistress who was the model for this painting. And you notice the interesting placement of the hand. And the come hither look that she has. But it's okay to paint this because that's not the Duke of Urbino's mistress. She just played the model for Venus. This is the goddess of love, people. Get your mind out of the gutter. Okay, so again, we're gonna fast forward through a whole bunch of stuff here, guys. Because you have the Renaissance, which leads into the Baroque, which your Caravaggio here is cusp Renaissance Baroque. So basically similar subject matter, but we're getting even more dramatic with the lighting and the sculptures. The technique gets really good in the Baroque period. I mean, amazing. And so we're progressing forward, and really things kind of stay, the styles change, but subject matter, everything like that stays pretty similar until we get to about the 1880s is when we see our next real big change in art. And that comes, now there's the jury is out on this in the art history world. Some people attribute Monet. Some people subscribe to the idea that Manet is the first modern artist, or the first who brings us Impressionism. Now, this is Edward Manet, so I think you can guess which one I subscribe to. And I want to point out the various similarities to these paintings. That is intentional. Manet meant to do that. The top one here is Luncheon on the Grass, and the bottom one is Olympia. Now, we look back at these with our modern eyes and we're like, well, what's the big deal? Okay. Well, how is this different? Well, first of all, the Luncheon on the Grass and Olympia are both depicting a regular woman. He is not telling people she's a goddess. And this is a woman people knew. Her name is Victorine. She was an artist in her own right, and it is said that she had other ways of making income. And we are very much aware that she is not a goddess. Like, look at the difference between Venus's gaze and Olympia's gaze. Venus here is the goddess of love. She's demure. She's come hither. Olympia is staring you down and daring you to look at her naked body. Very different. Okay. We also can tell that the difference of this scene down here looks a little more domestic. The presence of her woman here who's helping her bring in the flowers back societally in those days would have very much been clear that this is a regular woman laying on the bed and not a goddess. And then we have Luncheon on the Grass up here, where again, there's no indication that this is a goddess who's sitting here nude. And the fact that a lot of people knew Victorine, were familiar with her and what she did for a living, and these two men are just clothed and they're sitting and she's just blatant in all her nakedness. This was a big deal. Then you get into the stylistic changes, the fact that this isn't polished painting, this is very quick, because the Impressionists were trying to catch the impression of the light. They were interested in the light and how light played on the surroundings. And something else that was different is around this time we have the introduction of oil paints that come in tubes, which means artists could now go outside, take their canvas and paint. Versus this would have been a studio setup. Okay, this artist would have gone and sketched these outdoor areas and then painted from his sketches, versus Monet, who I do have, of course, who literally took his canvas and easel outside and painted what he saw in the moment. This is called Impression Sunrise. And that's where we get the name for Impressionists. Now, these guys were not liked by the Paris Salon, who back in those days was the be all and end all of who decided who was a good artist and not. So they opened their own salon and became the Impressionists. And that leads into where we start to really get art for man's sake. These guys are painting because they want to, not to devote anything to God. And these paintings start to become more and more domestic, more and more landscapes. And there's a lot of things that went into it. So then we get into Van Gogh, who's known as an expressionist because he is even more expressive with his paintings. Like the colors mean something in his paintings. This is called the Night Cafe. It's a bar that he used to frequent, and they said that like the glaring yellow against the red is he intended those colors to emote, to express how he felt about this bar, which was, a place where people were addicted to booze and bad things happened. And so he wanted it to be kind of glaring and not to look like a pretty place. And I've chose this one. This is the other Starry Night. Everybody knows Van Gogh for his Starry Night, and I very much wanted to include paintings that were other than that one. This is his other Starry Night. It's called Starry Night, but I call it the other Starry Night. So then, of course, we get into Picasso. And this is around the time I had one professor call it the window is breaking. So back in the Renaissance days, we look like we're looking through this beautiful window on a scene. Mm-hmm. And then these artists start to like break down that window. Like we're no longer looking at real life scenes anymore. We have Picasso who's breaking down what he sees into its geometric shapes. This is called Cubism. I believe Paul Cézanne predates him a little bit with the Cubists, but of course Picasso is the one we all know. He's very famous for it. Mind you, Picasso also lived to be very, very old and had a prolific career, and he was a classically trained artist. That's something not a lot of people know, is that he did learn how to paint like those Renaissance painters. He has some pretty amazing paintings that are very like in that style. He chose to break these rules. He chose that. And so around this time when we start to have the Cubists, we start to have a lot of different movements come through. And at one point we have this group of artists who are interested in the freedom of children, like how children just draw and paint and don't care. They're not going for something. They're not trying to depict necessarily anything. They're enjoying the art itself. And so these artists sit down and they decide, well, we're going to have a movement. We're going to make a movement. Back in these days, there was usually a manifesto that would be written about these movements, and it would be issued and people would read it to know what the intention behind this was. And so they didn't know what to call their movement. So the rumor is that they took a knife, they chucked it at the dictionary, and it landed on the word Dada, which is a German word. That's one theory that I like. So we're going with that one. One of these guys was Marcel Duchamp. And so art for art's sake. One professor told me that really Jackson Pollock is the one who and we'll get into him in a minute, who's like, okay, now art really is just for art's sake. But it's around this time. And so now we're also moving, the Paris Salon is no longer the be all and end all of who is art, okay? New York City is now the be all and end all. If you want to make it, you're in New York City now. Okay, so we have Marcel Duchamp, who's there in New York, and we have a gallery, and I forget the gallery's name, but we have a gallery in New York who's put out an ad in the paper that says, pay $10 and we will put your art up. Okay. So this is some of the backstory that a lot of people don't know about Duchamp's fountain. And so because when he read that, he was incensed at the idea that someone could just basically give them whatever they want, call it art, and pay the money, and they would be able to exhibit their work in a gallery and call it art. So he is said to have gone and acquired a urinal from a factory, turned it on its side, signed it R. Mutt, and submitted it, and then was rejected. And so he had his good buddy, I believe, if I'm remembering the whole story correctly, Stieglitz, put it up in his gallery. Stieglitz was married to Georgia O'Keeffe. He was a photographer. And so then that is the basis of that question, what is art? Because guess what everybody was talking about was Duchamp put a fountain or a urinal on its side. He's calling it art. And people took him serious. And it's my thought, because the thing is, nobody really knows. So again, this is another one that has a lot of theories. My thought is that he was being ironic, and a lot of people agree with this theory, that he was being ironic, that he sent this in to say, like, you're gonna just take exception, you're gonna take people paying you and you're gonna call it art, when all of us who work really hard at being artists like usually have to go through all this rigmarole, right? And then because of the times and what was going on, people looked at it and called it art. And so he went with it, and he's like, oh my God, okay, yeah, my urinal is art. Now the thing is, and I had a professor, I'm quoting a professor on this, who told us that there's actually no proof that this urinal was in mass production. There are some people, and I would like to believe this story, this is a story I choose to believe, that believe he actually did make this urinal. He actually created it. He didn't buy it. That it was not something mass produced, and signed it. And so making it, in a way, still an ironic commentary, because then he has crafted something with his own two hands in ceramic. Okay, something else that people would go to the galleries to see, beautiful ceramic pieces. But because the subject matter is now a urinal turned on its side, he's raised that question, what is art? And this was in the early 1900s, and I graduated college in 2012. And at least 4 different art history and or humanities classes had this exact discussion about what is art, all in reference to this urinal. So whether or not he created art, this man definitely created a legacy, because we're still talking about it. But this is my overall point is this is around where we're getting to art for art's sake, which is then the introduction to Jackson Pollock, who decided to, one day he used to lay his canvases down on the ground, because he painted these huge giant canvases. And so he would lay them down on the ground and he was painting, and one day the paint just dripped onto the canvas, and he just loved like the way it looked, and he decided, what if I just let paint be paint on canvas instead of having to be anything else? Mm-hmm. And there we have Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism, and from there on out, art just takes off for being art for art's sake. For me, the next really big movement that had a huge impact on the change of art, to the fact that I believe, again, I'm not saying this is in the textbooks, this is my opinion about art and art history, is still going on today, and that's Andy Warhol, who was commentating on the commercialism in America when he was a printmaker, so these are lithographic prints. He made a print of the Campbell's soup can and put it up and called it art. And so again, we're still talking about what is art. Cool unknown fact about Andy Warhol, well, not unknown, but not as well known as his Campbell's soup And the Maryland's is that he was an avid Polaroid user, and he would take lots and lots of pictures with his Polaroid camera. So, but anyways, so he was making the commentary. He really launched the pop art movement, where's the line between art and product and capitalism. And I used to hate pop art because I loved old traditional art so much, but the older I get, and working in marketing also, and realizing that like how deep this message goes. For instance, someone designed that Campbell's label. Someone took the time and put their artistry and their skill, and it's something we see so much. And of course, this label is going back to like the 50s and 60s, that we don't see art when we look at this Campbell soup label, but someone used their artistic talent and skill to make this, spent time crafting and deciding what font Campbell's would be in, what colors would be used, where the words would place, and then it's just mass produced and put on a shelf and looked at as a product. So I didn't appreciate in my art history days just how deep Andy Warhol's message was. And I think that's why it's still so everlasting, because we're still dealing with that in our society, the capitalism, the commercialism. And I think that's why it's still something people are still making and still exploring. That I get into my favorite artists. So I think, did we cover the three though? We covered art for God's, man's, and art's sake. What is art?
Yeah.
I think Andy Warhol, I'm gonna go back to him for a minute, launches us into one of the other big questions in art and art history is, does art imitate life, or does life imitate art? And depending on which day of the week you ask me that, I will have a different answer for you, because I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I think people have opinions and they'll say one way or the other. But if you look back throughout history, they definitely play off of each other for sure, because different societies that were, say, more militant will depict that in their art. And some societies that were more militant had less art. The reason we have so much from Athens is because the Spartans were off fighting all the time. We don't have that much like art created by Spartans, because their women were taking care of things while the men were off fighting. The Athenians were a lot more, they were naval and they were on the coast. So their society was different, and they produced a lot of the art that we know from that time. Is our society today more violent because of the media we watch and the stuff the fact that we watch so many violent movies and play violent video games, or are our video games and movies more violent because we are a more violent society? So Andy Warhol, I think, and pop art is really, I think, a good place if you're looking at art history and the timeline, a linear timeline, to start thinking about. And I think that was part of what he was commenting on too, and the other pop artists, was that question, like, is art reflecting life, or is life reflecting art? So he makes some prints of the Campbell soup cans and Marilyn Monroe, among others. Those are really just his two big ones, to say like, hey, I'm an artist, I've made this in this artistic form, but these are basically things you can go out to the store and buy, so that, and again, I mentioned earlier that really that kind of, I do know some artists that came after Andy Warhol, but for the most part, my love and interest in art history goes way back. So this is about where my knowledge ends. If we wanted to discuss my favorite artists, I found it interesting. I had never noticed this about myself, Tanisha, until this exercise. That I, for the most part, love printmakers and illustrations more than I think anything else. Because as much as I love medieval art, when I sat down to think of my favorite artists, Gustave Doré is always top. You know, I love him. He has some of the most famous illustrations. This is him. This is, I'm going to say it wrong, Chiron. This is the Dante's Divine Comedy. And this is illustrating they're about to cross over the river. So he's the boatman who's taking Dante and Virgil over into the underworld. And so, and I just love, there's something about, I was trying to think about why do I love printmakers so much? Why? And I think part of it is that I love theater. And so, especially getting later on into Toulouse-Lautrec and Alphonse Mucha and Aubrey Beardsley, a lot of their art that I love is like they were theater posters. And then I think growing up as a kid, just reading books, like some of the first exposure to art was the illustration in the books. Like, I love that they kind of capture a moment. I'm also big into photography. So like, I think with illustration, especially when we start to see a lot of printmaking, the technology was around. Photography was starting to come out, and you start to see artists, like you start to see them actually cropping out because they can now, and you start to see more snapshot like things in paintings and prints because they've been able to see photographs and how photographs do that. So this is Alphonse Mucha. He is an Art Nouveau artist, and a lot of people, like, he's kind of the example for Art Nouveau, but Aubrey Beardsley was around that same time. And this is Toulouse-Lautrec. If you've seen Moulin Rouge, the movie, the short little guy, that's Toulouse. He really was short, and he died of syphilis. And yes, he hung out at the Moulin Rouge. This is another one. This is my favorite Toulouse-Lautrec because it was an advertisement for a photographer on 9 Place Pigalle in Montmartre, and I was a photography student, so it just has always been my favorite. And this is my favorite photographer. This is Jerry Ulsman, who actually lives up in Gainesville, I think, and I believe taught photography at UF. These are all darkroom photographs. And so this is like really my only surrealist in the group. But the fact that he does this in the darkroom, not Photoshop, and his photo, they're so cool. I do miss that. So, well, I mean, that's just really, I think if you're interested in learning more about art history, how art history relates to society, those are kind of the big three, like, what is art? So, and the only answer to that question I could ever determine that's actually like able to relate to everybody is that art is human expression, and that's going to mean something different for everybody. And so, but many hours spent in lengthy debates in class where people argued what was and what wasn't art. So that's why my answer is that. The three, at least in Western art, again, it being that, it kind of starts out, and you want to talk about art imitating life imitating art. I mean, our first artists are really just painting on caves or making sculptures or things that reflect what they're seeing out in nature. And then when we have a more developed pantheon of mythology, be it the polytheistic religion of Greece and Rome or the Judeo-Christian religions, we start to have art for God's sake. Then as that expanded and the shift towards focusing on literally the human form, but also societally becoming at least in the Middle Ages, what happened was they rediscovered Plato and they started to become, they had lost all this knowledge about the societies before Christianity. They had spent hundreds of years believing that, basically the world began and ended with Adam and Eve, and then, we have this whole other thought and process that we are descended from. Wait, how do we tie this together? And in doing that, they started to explore Plato philosophy and how did that tie into Christianity, and then you've got art becoming more realistic in the technique. So again, now focusing more on man, and then you have fast forward 100 years and you've got that's become antiquated, and you have artists who are like, well, wait. And again, this always ties in hand in hand with some kind of technology advancement or society advancement or shift in society as well, because without that addition to those paints they could carry outside, would we have had Impressionism? If Monet and those guys couldn't have taken their easels out and painted that quickly, the impression of the light. So you have that, and then, I think that question of, does art imitate life or does life imitate art, is as unanswerable in a concrete way as which came first, the chicken or the egg.